Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everyone to this tonight's event organized by Contemporary Turkish Studies and the European Institute at LSE. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy and I'm Professor of European Politics and Chair of Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE. Tonight we will discuss developments in Turkish political economy since the early 2000s in light of the contributions of the late Kemal Dervish. This event is, in a way, in memory of Kemal Dervish, who sadly passed away in May at the age of 74. As everybody in Turkey knows, Dervish was a world-renowned economist who served in the World Bank for more than 20 years. Later in his career, he was the administrator of the UNDP from 2005 to 2009, and he also served as the head of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution in DC. In Turkey, Dervish was mostly known for his economic restructuring program following the 2001 economic crisis. At a deep time or at a crisis time, at a deep crisis time, Dervish left his career in the World Bank and accepted to become the Minister of Economic Affairs. Thanks to his efforts and the IMF stabilization programs, the economy was put back on track. The following AKP government continued the plan for around a decade, and Turkey achieved stable levels of inflation, economic growth, and foreign direct investment. Tonight, Professor Selva Demiralp will explain to us how these reforms in the early 2000s compare with reforms in the Turkish economy today, and perhaps how, in important respects, for some in Turkey, Dervish's legacy is still a benchmark of success. However, we will hear from Kemal Osan and Sinan Ülgen today as well, and they will tell us more about the character of Kemal Dervish, who was much more than a technocratic economist. As two people who had the privilege of working with him closely, they will be able to remind us of his personality and of his vision for global politics, global economic development, academia, and civil society's involvement in public policy. It is a privilege for me to chair this event and host it at LSE. Kemal Dervish was an LSE graduate. He studies his undergraduate degree and master's degree in economics. He graduated in 1970 and then he moved to Princeton for his PhD studies. I was not lucky enough to meet Kemal Dervish in person, but I have heard many stories about his wonderful personality. And one of the things that strike me in these stories is his humility and modesty. It's my impression that he would have wanted an event to commemorate him, to focus on his vision for politics and economy rather than him alone. This is in part why the discussion tonight and the title of our event does not highlight his name as such. After this introduction, I will yield the floor to our speakers, but before I do that, let me also quickly introduce them. Our first speaker will be Kemal Osan, who is a senior economist at the Bank of Canada and a research economist at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Our second speaker will be Selva Demiralp, who is professor of economics at Koç University, the director of the Koç University TÜSİAD Economic Research Forum, and the founding partner at Ethos Economics Consulting. And our third and final speaker will be Sinan Ülgen, who is the director and founding chairman of the think tank EDAM, the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. Sinan is also a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe in Brussels and a managing partner of the consultancy Istanbul Economics. For those Twitter X users in the audience, when posting about this event, please use hashtag LSE Turkey. And I would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded, and as long as we do not encounter any technical difficulties, we will make it available as a podcast and as a YouTube video. After around 40 minutes of initial interventions from our speakers, we will open the floor for questions. You can ask your questions to the speakers by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. I will read out as many questions as possible, but please also let us know your name and affiliation. Now I'm delighted to hand over to our first speaker, Kemal, for his talk.
Thank you very much, Yaprak Hocam. I prepared some slides to help me with the outline of my talk, so let me share my screen first. Can you see my screen? All good?
All good. We can see the screen and the slides.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I would like to start with thanking the organizers for kindly inviting me to this panel. Within the time interval I have, I will focus the late Kemal Dervish's economic thought and give several examples from his recent work. But before I start, I should highlight that the views expressed are my own and not my employer's. These are solely my thoughts. Kemal passed away after a long disease on May 7th this year. And those who were fortunate to interact with him witnessed his kindness and had the privilege of learning from him. So I was one of those lucky ones, actually. And I worked with him at the Brookings Institution between 2012 and 13 as his research associate. And then I received his advice during my PhD studies, and he served as one of my advisors in my PhD committee. So I was very fortunate to learn from him. So let me briefly mention his extraordinary career. Like Yaprak Hocam also mentioned about this, but he started his career as an assistant professor at Princeton. He also served as an assistant professor at the Middle East Technical University in early his career. And he held various positions within the World Bank. And most recently, he served as the vice president for poverty reduction and economic management, and also vice president for the Middle East and North Africa region. He later famously served as the Minister of Economic Affairs in the 57th government of the Republic of Turkey, and then became a member of the Turkish parliament. Later on, he was appointed as the head of the United Nations Development Program by Kofi Annan, and most recently, he served as the vice president and director of the Global Economy Program at Brookings, where I met him. He also held various advisory positions, like including Institute du Bosphore and Sabancı University, and he was a passionate public servant. So Kemal has many contributions in various areas of economics and public policy. So he deeply cared about international cooperation, global governance, climate change, inequality, productivity, and he extensively wrote in these areas. I also would like to cite a special report that is published by Brookings just yesterday. I was also fortunate to contribute to this report, and you can see several columns from the authors who were fortunate enough to interact with him and learn from him, and how his thoughts in these areas were significant. I think it would be correct to say that he always believed in the beneficial role of the policy in improving economic outcomes. This is very much in Keynesian spirit, actually. He was well aware that economic and political disorganization combined with obsolete human capital of agents and politicians slow down economic progress, and there is always a role for the policy to ameliorate these quote-unquote frictions that are available in the market economy. But his measure of economic performance was not limited to economic growth. He also attached importance to fighting against poverty, equal opportunity. For example, when you look at the numbers from the crisis years in 2001, 2002, the shares of public investment in education and health were higher than in those previous years. So I'm citing also a book that he gives an interview about those years. And he very much believed in the crucial role of international cooperation. So this is very much related with the topic of today's panel. Also, International Monetary Fund is recently introducing this international cooperation aspect into their framework. But This is just happening after the global financial crisis, and Kemal was very well aware of its importance, like since early his career. I would like to talk about two examples from his recent work. The first one is about European integration and how to engage Turkey within this European integration. And then I will talk about sanctions related with the recent experience, related with the economic sanctions that were introduced to Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. So related with the European integration, Europe experienced a series of crises, like starting from 2008 onwards. First, there were huge current account imbalances between the northern and southern countries that ended up in non-productive sectors. And then when those capital flows suddenly reversed and changed directions, that put pressure to those recipient countries like Spain, Portugal, Ireland. And Europe needed to reinvent itself. Like the problem was like there was one monetary policy for the core countries, like who were belonging to the Eurozone, but there was no single fiscal policy or no coherent banking policy, like what is called banking union in the policy notes. So Kemal contributed very much into this debate. He he suggested that Europe needs to reinvent itself. The answer should be more integration, not not the destruction of Europe. But when Europe reinvents itself, it should be in a different structure. And he suggested two Europes in one. For example, at the center, he suggested a Eurozone at the core, but within a second layer of Europe, like there is no currency union, for example. And there can be like two European commissions for the core and the enlarged parts of Europe. One large European parliament, like with increased powers, for example, for those at the core, but not everyone has voting rights. Maybe those who are in the second circle won't have the voting rights because they are not that much integrated as much as the core countries. So there could be one representative economics minister for the core, but there could be one representative foreign affairs minister for the enlarged part of this new Europe. And he was very much thinking about Turkey also back in those years when he was suggesting these ideas. I'm talking about years 2012, 13. And he always suggested Turkey to participate in these talks. And by proposing this kind of argument, for example, Turkey could be one of the founding fathers of New Europe and could join or participate in this new structure of Europe. So he always thought like Turkey's place was in Europe, but nowhere else. And I would like to end my section by just mentioning multilateralism, like also built on his ideas. And my motivation, of course, is coming from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like that happened last year on February 24th. And we observed like sanctions by 38 governments, like it was unprecedented in history, like since the 1930s. And Russia is the 11th largest economy, and this is also something new, like in the last 80, 90 years, sanctioning a country at the size of Russia. So if you introduce economic sanctions to a very large economy, it has repercussions to those who are introducing sanctions and also for those who are not joining the sanctions. So international cooperation introducing sanctions is also key. This is very much related with my recent research with Fabio Gironi from the University of Washington and Dyson Kim at the North Carolina State University. Like we study how international cooperation can affect the impact of sanctions, both to the sanctioning and the sanctioned economies. So when there is international cooperation, for example, in introducing sanctions, it increases the impact, but it is always at the expense of the welfare for those joining the sanctions. So this opens the door to provide incentives. Maybe there could be negotiations like with the West and the third countries like India, China, and Turkey to encourage them in joining the sanctions with talks about participation in post-war construction, for instance. And it is also important to distinguish between political leaders and ordinary citizens when introducing sanctions, because sanctions are introduced to to end the war, which is very destructive and should not happen in today's world. But it is also hurting the ordinary citizens and can damage the public opinion on the West and its values. Maybe there should be discussions on easing conditions for those in Russia and trying to leave. And this also opens the door for international cooperation, as third countries who are not currently joining the sanctions will play a particular role on those. So with the geofragmentation and with the current stance of the world order, like, we need more thoughts like that is based on Kemal's values, like international cooperation and and and uh, and focusing on the ordinary citizens' benefits and preserving those vulnerable. Okay, I would like to end here and leave the stage for Selva Hocam.
Thank you very much for that. And you finished before 12 minutes. So thank you very much for that as well. And yes, Salva is next, and I think she has slides. So maybe you can share them with us now.
Okay, sure. Before I share my slides, let me note that I'm honored to be here. Yaprak Hanım mentioned that she was not lucky enough to meet Kemal Dervish in person. I should start by noting that I was lucky and privileged enough to meet him in person, but my first encounter with him was via email. In 2013, I started writing a weekly column in a local newspaper, Milliyet. Back then, it was quite different than it is now. And I was trying to find my place in this new world, trying to find the balance between the academia and the real world. And every once in a while, I tried to come up with simplifying examples to illustrate basic theoretical concepts to broader masses. And in one piece, I gave a metaphor and resembled the economy to a marathon runner and noted that the idea is to keep a persistent pace, and the central bank's job is to maintain that speed. And if you want to run faster, that's up to the trainer or the government to improve the performance of the athlete. I then received an unexpected email from Kemal Dervish telling me that he is following my column and really enjoyed my metaphor and told me that I had very lucky students at Koç University. That short email gave me all the support and energy and the confidence that I needed as I exposed myself to the broader masses and left my safe haven in my comfortable office at the university. So I am very thankful to him, who contributed to who I am. And right now, let me share my slides. Okay. So what I would like to do in my 10 minutes is to briefly discuss the Turkish economy since 2000 and what is different at this time around, because just like the 2001 crisis, Turkish economy has been very close to the edge of a balance of payments crisis shortly before the general elections in May 2023. So I would like to discuss what is similar and what is different at this time around. So the economic policies after the elections resemble the adaptation of the program introduced by Kemal Dervish, because both incidences represent a sharp U-turn from the highly accommodative policies that were in place before the crisis circumstances. In the case of the transition program to a strong economy, which was developed by Dervish and his team, the U-turn was far more pronounced, and the program was put into action at an impressive pace. Although these programs, both the strong economy transition program to strong economy and the current midterm program are adopted during the same government, back then there was a very frank criticism of what went wrong, and very solid solutions as to what needs to be done. Whereas right now, even though there is a turn to orthodox policies, the turn is far more subtle. There's not much of an accountability, or there isn't much of a discussion about what went wrong in the past. And the solutions that are put forward are more vague, as I will try to give more specific examples. So the main question I have in mind is whether what we have right now is really a U-turn, or whether it's more of a detour that at some point, if Erdogan prefers to go back to the old policies, the current program might end. Because if you don't really criticize what was wrong in the past, then there's always room to go back when you wish. That's the main concern that I have, and the main difference, I think, is between the two programs, because with the old program, we knew that this was a new page and there was no turning back. One of the key characteristics of Dervish era was a very quick start. When I check the timing, it's really amazing that Dervish arrives in Turkey on March 1st, 2001. And in less than 2 months, we see that the program is announced, transition to the strong economy. And on April 14th, the law that grants independence to the central bank is already accepted, April 25th, I'm sorry. So this is a archive from Milliyet showing Dervish and says he started fast. Indeed, I mean, that is a very impressive time period, that within a month and a half, you diagnose the problems and you come up with solutions, and you actually start implementing and taking very important steps towards progress. Here is now an example from the program implemented by Dervish and the program that is put into practice, the midterm plan that is put into practice at around 100 days after the current elections. The column on the left is an example. I'm sorry, these are in Turkish, but I'm going to translate. This is the sugar law that passed on April 4th, 2001, where in the program, it tells you that the government will no longer announce the price for sugar, and the free market mechanism is going to take over, and the government's, the state's losses from this process will therefore be eliminated, and therefore this will be the way the budget deficit is going to be at least partly addressed. Now, there is a solid criticism of what went wrong here and how they are going to fix this. And when they say we are going to increase public savings, you see the immediate ways the government is going to handle this. Whereas when you look at the column on the right, this is from the midterm plan that is announced this summer, again about the agricultural policies. But here you see a much less, I should say, specific steps. For example, it says, we are going to look at the minimum and maximum production areas. We are going to take applications from the farmers. We are going to achieve stability in food prices. We are going to form a new region. But as you can guess, these are very vague. So you don't really see how this is going to fix the problem. So yeah, okay, some regions are going to be formed. We are going to talk to the farmers, but it is nothing like the steps, the solid steps that were taken in the transition to the strong economy program. Now, what are the similarities? In both cases, we had very dollarized economies and there were pressures on the exchange rate. When we look at the ratio of foreign exchange denominated deposits to total deposits, it increased from 25% in 1990 to 42% in 1999, right before the 2001 crisis, which gave way to Kemal Dervish taking over the economy. And right now, the situation is even worse in terms of the dollarization, including the foreign exchange protected deposits. The total dollar denominated deposits to total deposits is around 68%. And central banks' international reserves, excluding swaps, are at historically low levels. So in an attempt to maintain low interest rate policies, since September 2021, it actually goes back to 2018 maybe, but things picked up pace after September 2021. Central banks' reserves, foreign exchange reserves, were sold in order to control pressures on the lira. And as a result, well, in this chart, again, this is in Turkish, unfortunately, because this is from local media platforms. But what you see here is the orange line is central bank's gross international reserves, and the blue bars are the central bank's net international reserves after you subtract swap agreements. The net reserves, as you can see, are have dipped shortly before the elections. And right now, even though there is an improvement, I mean, relative improvement, our net reserves are still significantly negative. Nevertheless, the central bank and the fiscal policy did return to a more orthodox view. So with the increase in interest rates, we do see the pressures on the exchange rate declining. And as a result, central banks' reserves are becoming less negative. Another resemblance between the Dervish era and the current era are the problems in the banking system. The presence of zombie firms and potential bankruptcies following a tightening cycle are the common threats that existed back then and right now. However, thanks to the structural reforms implemented by Kemal Dervish and his team, our banking system is in much better shape. We have seen the benefits of this during the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, where even though in the rest of the world, the banking system had trouble with the toxic assets, due to the regulations that were implemented back then and our ability to protect those regulations through the Banking Regulatory Agency, our banks were not adversely affected. And even when we fluctuate at home with all these exchange rate crises or inflation crisis, we know that we can go to that with peace in mind because our banking system is in very good shape. What do I mean by this? For example, when you look at the capital adequacy ratios of the Turkish banks, even after all the mishandled economic policies, even though Turkish banks had to hold fixed interest rate government bonds through regulations to keep the bond rates lower, the capital adequacy ratios are still very high. We have enough buffer to absorb shocks to the banking system. And in terms of the non-performing loans, during 2001, we do see that non-performing loans were significantly high. But again, through the regulations, the healthiness of the banking system has improved. With the right supervision, we see that the non-performing loan ratios are much lower, just like the capital adequacy ratios. Our basic banking statistics indicate a very healthy banking system, thanks to the reforms that were put into place during Kemal Dervish. Another common feature between the two periods is inflation. So in 2001 era, we see that there was chronic inflation. Then with the implementation of central bank reform that I mentioned, central bank for the first time in Turkish monetary history is granted independence. And we see a very successful disinflation period. Inflation was maintained at single digits for a long time. But then, unfortunately, we see that the independence of the central bank is eroded. Central bank credibility declined substantially. And then after 2021, we see a sharp increase in inflation that it almost reverses all the gains in inflation that took place in the post-2001 period. And what is worse is that this was chronic inflation. In the case of chronic inflation, when everybody expects high two-digit inflation, you can protect people better. Whereas when you see a sharp increase, like we see here, a very rapid acceleration, that's when you see the poverty kicking in and the worst side effects of inflation affecting the masses. Couple more slides. In terms of the budget discipline, again, thanks to the reforms implemented during Dervish era, this is the government's debt stock as a percentage of GDP. Budget discipline was maintained, achieved, and maintained. Although there is a slight deterioration in the years before the general elections, it is still not as bad as it was around 2001. So once again, being able to anchor and establish budget discipline is a good inheritance that we still benefit today. In terms of the current account deficit, here the blue bars show Turkey's current account balance. And the overall negative region and current account deficit being in the negative zone shows that we didn't do much progress, unfortunately. That was one of the weaknesses. We do have a chronic current account deficit problem. The only time we can improve our current account balance is when the economy slows down, like when we have a recession, then we have a surplus. Again, recession, surplus, recession, deficit declines. That's because our production structure that relies on imports of intermediate goods, unfortunately, hasn't changed much. We didn't make much progress. So to wrap up, what needs to be done going forward and what went wrong? Over time, the main pillars of the transition to the strong economy have weakened, especially the emphasis on institutional independence, unfortunately weakened, the emphasis on transparency and the regulations against corruption have weakened, which mainly resulted in the economy that we are in, economic problems that we are in right now. What needs to be done is just like what Kemal Dervish did. The government needs to be very specific about what the problem is and what went wrong and how it is going to be fixed. Central bank independence has to be re-granted. Structural reforms to enhance productivity growth, such as education and innovation, has to be established. There were significant structural reforms during Dervish era. And public savings, like transparency of public auctions, again, something that was introduced during Dervish and then unfortunately wasn't maintained. Rule of law has to be re-established and return to rationality and transparency. Mehmet Şimşek rightly noted the importance of these factors, but we need to see more solid action. Now, do we need...
Saiva, is it possible to wrap up in, let's say, 10 seconds?
All right. This was just because the title of the event is about IMF. If you want, I can skip this one and we can discuss with the questions and answers.
Let's discuss it after Sinan's.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. But that was a very comprehensive comparison between the two programs. And thanks also for sharing the anecdote at the beginning. It was lovely to hear. And I think we will hear many stories like that or other stories like that from Sinan. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, Yaprak. First, let me start by congratulating the center, the Contemporary Turkish Studies Center, for having organized this. I think it's an event that we attach a great importance to as people who have known Kemal Dervish, who's worked with him, but also I'm sure people who have not known him personally, but have come to appreciate the values that he represents and the contributions that he's made over the years to Turkey, but not only to Turkey, to the global environment, the global policy environment, really, because he was somebody who had a keen interest on those global issues. What I want to do, and the way that I've planned this, short set of remarks, is to start with my perceptions of Kemal Dervish. What made him so a very valuable friend. Then go to the institutional side and tell you a little bit about what we were able to do together. And finally, also a few points for general policy making. When I think about Kemal Dervish and who he was and what he represented, I've noted down a few elements, really. The first one I've already alluded to is his very keen and deep interest in public policy, not just as an economist, by the way, but really overall in public policy, how to improve the livelihood of humanity in general. Of course, that is a big word, but this is really what it leads to. And that's why he had an interest in political reform, economic reform at home, but also on global issues like global governance. And the first real work that I have had an opportunity to contribute was essentially when he was writing a book on global governance. He gave me an advanced copy, a draft, and asked my remarks and my contributions. It had nothing to do with Turkey, but everything about global governance, about how the institutions of global governance, whether mostly the economic institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, had to be reformed, what was wrong with them. And this was somebody who was an insider, given his professional career at these institutions. So it was doubly interesting for me to be able to read that and comment on it and give my remarks. Secondly, related to that, he was a polymath. That's really a term that I like, because it shows you the deep and various level of interest that one person can have. Kemal Dervish was such a unique person to be really defined as a polymath, because yes, he was an economist, but as I've tried to highlight, he was not just an economist. He was trying to link a number of different disciplines to his core knowledge basis. So he was interested in how politics affect economics. He was interested how everything that has to do with political economy angle. We even talked at the time, there was no ChatGPT, but we talked about technology with him, about how technology would impact the future of humanity, how would it impact labor markets, what the next generation will have to experience compared to our generation and his generation. So in that sense, he was a polymath who had also a very deep intellectual curiosity. So you could have these very engaging conversations with him. He would ask you questions, even in areas where, de facto, he probably didn't have that type of knowledge as rich a knowledge as he had on the side of the economy. But he was all very, very, interested and keen to engage in these conversations. And he would always ask you the right questions that made you think and before answering. It was in that sense, you had to be always on your toes. There were no easy answers that you could share with Kemal Dervish. You should think twice about how you want to answer that. And that was also a very rich part of the conversation that we had. It was a conversation not just about Turkey. It was a conversation about the global environment. It was a conversation about the future of Europe, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. That's also something that he cared deeply about, not only embedding Turkey in Europe. He saw Turkey's future in Europe, but also he wanted to improve how Europe was ruled, how Europe was governed, He was one of the Turkish participants, along with Damla Gürel, one of our founders at EDAM as well, who participated in the Convention on the Future of Europe in the early part of this century. He had an uncanny ability to explain things to you. We saw him operate, on those grounds when he came to Turkey, as Selva Hoca has already demonstrated with her, with the newspaper articles. We all remember that time, or well, some of them may not, if we are being listened to some of our younger crowds at LSE. But nonetheless, we all remember him when he came to Turkey and he was in front of TVs and explaining things. He was a very credible communicator, and that was also, I think, part of his success in trying to steer the Turkish economy, because obviously that sort of communication is key about how you build expectations, how you manage expectations. But it's also key when you talk to your international partners. They want to hear from you truth. They want to hear from you a frank assessment of where things are and where things could go. And Kemal Dervish was exactly the type of person who could tell that story in those terms. And perhaps finally, talking about him, the most remarkable, and you may want to think after all of this, what can be even more remarkable? But I think the most remarkable character trait that he had was his humility. Despite all of these important qualities that he had, that I've tried to enlist and trying to do justice at least, he was somebody who's very humble, very approachable, regardless of who you were. You could be a university student who would talk to you. You could be a member of parliament, he could talk to you. You could be, a young academic starting to write for a newspaper, he would approach you. Değil mi Selva Hocam? So that's the type of humility which in the Turkish political establishment you rarely see. And it was a very, very, very fresh, mode of behavior when you have such a person who's had this illustrious career, whose head is, fame under the sun, being so approachable and so humble. So that's, I think, something that we need to highlight. Now, what was my own personal experience working with them is we set up EDAM together in 2005. With the idea that it would be a policy think tank, fully independent, credible, and it would establish its credibility through this objective academic research. It, I think, fulfilled a gap. It addressed a need in Turkey where we have few such independent think tanks, and even fewer really over the years, which is a sad story. Instead of really having an environment which would have allowed these type of entities to blossom, unfortunately, that has not what has happened. But we were able to build on those premises over the years, even after Kemal Dervish left Turkey and went to head the UNDP. The impetus that he gave us in setting the right norms, in setting the right structures in terms of how a policy think tank should be, has allowed us to carry this work over now almost 2 decades, since 2005 is the establishment. The second aspect of this was that in addition to this, the research part, which we also launched together a yearly event, which over the years, this year we're going to do the 19th iteration of it. It's now called the Bodrum Roundtable, but it's become quite a prestigious event in Turkey itself, where we discuss global issues, because the idea was essentially to bring the global conversation to Turkey and talk about global issues in Turkey. Don't talk about Turkey, but talk about global issues in Turkey, and also bring a Turkish perspective to that global conversation. So that was the idea. And when you set up an initiative like that, the path to success may be conditional on a few critical elements. One of them is, well, whether you have the money. We didn't. Two, maybe whether you have government support. We didn't. But three, which is what we had, is launch it with somebody like Kemal Dervish, who had this, amazing network globally that he had built over the years based on the qualities that I mentioned in the first part of my remarks. And so therefore, the people that came to our events were formidable. These were the people who, had active roles in the national administrations, in parliaments, in European institutions, in international media, So that was the type of crowd that we were able to pull in. And therefore, despite the fact of not having government support or, sizable funding, we were able to build this as a success story. Finally, on top of this, maybe I want to end on a slightly less positive note, which is that the idea behind establishing a policy think tank was essentially to contribute to policy making. Now, Turkey has a public administration culture that is very difficult to accept this type of external input. This has nothing to do with the current government. It's been like that, all the time since I've known and having worked in public administration before. But we wanted to break this vicious circle. I think ultimately we did not succeed. I don't think that today Turkey is at a better place in terms of how civil society and the policy making interacts. The environment has become even more difficult. So instead of building up a formal space for this type of interaction, that has not happened, and this interaction is now limited more on the basis of whether you are basically, on the basis of partisan partisan selection. So that's where I think, as an initiative, we were not able to have the traction that we envisaged with Kemal Dervish. Maybe things would have been different had he stayed here, and maybe with him, with his experience, with his network, we may have all benefited in terms of creating the type of more inclusive policy environment that this country deserves.
Thank you very much, Sinan. That was actually very touching, and I took several notes in terms of Kemal Dervish's vision and what we can do as the next generation, I guess, in contemporary Turkish studies at LSE and also elsewhere. So I was going to ask you some questions or give you the opportunity to respond to one another, but then Selva couldn't actually finish the last slide. So what I'm planning to do now, and I see that we have also questions already. So what I prefer to do is to post some of the questions and give the opportunity to Selva to also talk about the IMF a bit. others can also write their questions. So we will do a couple of rounds of questions, hopefully, if we have enough time. And I will try to group the questions together and pose as many questions as possible. So one of the things that I'd like to highlight is that this organization actually came together with a lot of inputs from colleagues at Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE, and also friends of Contemporary Turkish Studies. And İlhan Nebioğlu is one of those friends who has already made comments. And it was his idea, actually, to do this event in memory of Kemal Dervish. And he also has shared some anecdotes about Kemal and the things that he went through during the economic reform program. So just reading his comments, he says, İlhan Nebioğlu says, Kemal Dervish was an internationalist. His worldwide contacts, his respectability, prestige, all added up to his credibility. He had a fascinating networks, and this was his strength. But then he also notes that it was very difficult for Kemal to execute his structural reforms, especially in telecommunications, because of continuous objection and paranoia from some of the government officials. And he even had sleepless nights. There's another question on this above, so I'll come back to that later. But then to continue with the comments, that Kemal Dervish was an LSE graduate, but yes, he was actually a first-class LSE graduate. And he was a PhD at Princeton at the age of 23, and that was remarkable. So all of these wonderful qualities we should not forget. But I want to ask the question, I guess, to the speakers. Based on his respectability, Kemal Dervish's respectability, prestige, and credibility, I wonder if you think, and any one of you can choose to answer this question as well. In economics, if you think that the prestige of a minister, for instance, or whoever is in charge of the economy matters in international circles, in increasing foreign aid, in perhaps also finding loans from international organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank. So that would be my first question, driving from İlhan Nebioğlu's comments. The second question will relate to the IMF issue, and I will ask specifically Selva to answer this question. So do we expect a potential agreement with the IMF now? One of the things that is quite striking is that there's a very negative understanding of the IMF in Turkey. Under these conditions, and given this, unpopularity of the IMF, would or should we expect another agreement or another loan from an international organization? Should this happen, or how would it happen? And then my final question is somewhat my own. This I want to ask specifically to Kemal, and also perhaps Sinan can chip in. It's about the customs union agreement with the European Union. I mean, we mentioned that Kemal Dervish actually championed deepening of relations between the European Union and Turkey. And Selva has also mentioned the significance of the trade balance and the current accounts balance. So I'm wondering if he had any thoughts on renewing or changing the customs union, changing the conditions of the customs union, and whether or not you think such a change is essential for Turkey to have a better economic prospect in the future. So let's start with Selva, and then the others can chip in. I'm sorry if there were too many questions. I hope it would be all right to go through them all.
Okay, so let me then answer the question that
Mhm.
Yaprak Hanım raised through the last slide, because the question is, would the credibility of the policymaker matter in obtaining funding? Absolutely, and I think that was one of the key reasons. I was reading Taha Akyol's Laf Dinlemedi book, actually, because he has a good chapter for the Dervish era, and it refreshes your memories. I recommend it. And there he is talking about how Ecevit is trying hard to convince Dervish and calls Dervish one night and says, you have to come tomorrow. And Kemal Bey says, I can't because I have things to do. So I think he gets like 1 week through bargaining with Ecevit at that time. But yes, the government was insistent on Kemal Bey due to his well-established network and respectability at the World Bank. So when he accepts the position, he goes back and secures a significant amount of funding. And it's not just the amount of money that we get from the World Bank or the IMF, but also the conditions, because the existing standby agreement with the IMF was rewritten back then. And Kemal Bey tried hard to make the conditions as appealing to the Turkish working class as possible, like bargaining for the wage increases and setting less aggressive inflation goals to the agreement so that it's not going to be a very sudden injection of the bitter medicine. Now, how are we doing now? And do we need the IMF? So this was my last slide. Now, the idea of the midterm plan is, can we do something similar to the standby agreement that the IMF would come up with, and don't restrict us in the way IMF is going to do, have more independence? Well, unfortunately, the midterm economic plan, is not as direct and solution-oriented as the plan that was prepared in line with the IMF standby agreement in 2001. So it's not as easy. If we get the IMF approval, so I mean, it's not just about signing the agreement with the IMF, because when you have the IMF agreement, it's not just, let's say, $50 billion that you're going to get from the IMF, but the foreign direct investment and the capital inflows that are going to come with it because of the IMF seal. It's just going to increase the overall confidence that the government is going to commit and stick to the targets that are put in the program. That is important. Right now, our main problem is the credibility problem. There has been, like I mentioned at the first round, there has been a significant erosion. There has been lots of zigzags, backs and forths, like the Naci Ağbal experience, the central bank chair who tried to hike interest rates, and then he was sacked after staying at the job for 4 months. So we didn't forget this, and the foreign investors didn't forget. And when foreign investors are coming, they are not coming to help us out. They are coming for a stable economy where they can have profit opportunities. But when they cannot be sure about that stability, then the money is not going to come in as easily. And that's what we have observed so far. After 4 months of the current government, yes, there's some money coming in, but it is nothing compared to the significant capital inflows that we had experienced back then. The government announced that they secured $35 billion from the World Bank, similar to how much Kemal Dervish was able to obtain. However, when you look at the details, it's not exactly the same, because the $18 billion that the World Bank mentioned is just an extension of a line. It's project-based, and they are just saying that we will take your applications, project applications, and we might approve them in the next, let's say, 3 years. So we haven't seen, like I said, the inflow of capital either from the World Bank or from the international private investors so far. So if the team does not gain enough credibility to attract sufficient capital inflows, and they haven't yet, then IMF can be an option, because, as I mentioned, our currency reserves are at dangerously low levels. So I don't know if it is going to be the route that will be taken, but it is definitely an option to consider at the table.
Okay. Thank you very much for that
you.
very detailed answer. Kemal, do you want to continue with the question of the customs union, perhaps? Or any other question that you might want to address?
Sure. Like I mean, as much as I remember, like if the recent data has not changed, like the biggest trading partner of Turkey is the European Union and Germany per se. So any trade between European Union and Turkey is at great importance, like to both parties, like especially to Turkey, because we are not the largest trading partner of European Union, obviously. So there is too much welfare that is being delivered from this interaction. But in following like Kemal's thoughts, like he was not only advocating for trade relationship between European Union and Turkey. Like what is important is to have a framework. Like, and we don't need European Union for those, but we need transparency, like free speech, or like the institutional framework, for instance that can deliver higher welfare. And the legislation in European Union is very much helpful in adopting these, but they can be introduced like also independently. And this is not only related with trade; it is a whole package. I would say the interaction with the European Union and Europe, from the Turkish perspective.
Okay, thank you. Sinan, would you like to add anything?
Well, yes. I mean, I was part of the team that negotiated the customs union, so I feel, I need to add something when this question is, is tabled. Regarding Kemal Dervish, his agenda was not so much on the customs union deepening, but it was really about how to integrate Turkey in Europe, in the EU. So he was very much pushing for political reforms, economic reforms, but also pushing and leveraging his network in Europe for Europe to embrace Turkey. That's where he was. And I think today, not having him play this role is going to be, unfortunately, a handicap, because there aren't too many people like that who have this type of network, which is not a network that is built through political links, but it's a network built through basically friendship, working together on global and common themes. And that network is much more powerful. So that's basically the role that he had. Everywhere he went to Europe, he was championing Turkey's European vocation and progress in the Turkey-EU relationship. Now, moving beyond that, whether we need a modernized customs union, yes, we do need a modernized customs union for a host of reasons. One, the current customs union actually only covers trade in manufactured goods. That's only about 20% of the Turkish economy, if at that. The modernized customs union will include services in its scope. This is where the big part of a national economy is, including the Turkish economy, where we talk about the 70% of the Turkish economy. So that's one reason. The second reason is liberalizing trade in services is a very different exercise than liberalizing trade in goods. Liberalizing trade in goods is actually much easier and simpler. Trade in services is much more difficult, but it's also more potentially much more important, because it is about regulatory harmonization. And if indeed we do get there, the customs union modernization, it is going to be a bit like an IMF program without the IMF, because it is going to be the blueprint for regulatory reform in Turkey, for policy reform. This is what it is, because the negotiations, as you all know, is a misnomer. We don't negotiate with the EU about how they're going to change their acquis. But it's all about adoption of the EU acquis, under which conditions Turkey will adopt, with which sort of transition or derogation. So it's not even in that sense a bona fide negotiation. But if we understand that this we can leverage as a blueprint for policy reform in Turkey, and this is exactly what we need, because after the end of the IMF program in what was it, 2007, Turkey did not really have this type of comprehensive policy reform agenda. It does not mean that Turkey has not done policy reform. It has, but it was more like a piecemeal and more probabilistic agenda than this, this comprehensive, more holistic work on policy reform. So that's what the customs union modernization will provide. And here I appeal to all my, European friends, because it's wrong to think that this is actually a gift to Turkey. It is not. It is, but it will enable Turkey to improve its governance, to improve the norms of its political economy in a way that's of mutual interest and benefit both to Turkey and to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm going to select a few more questions. So I will start with Orkun Saka. Orkun is based in the City University London, is also a fellow at LSE. And he's also our resident economist at Contemporary Turkish Studies. So he has a question to all speakers. When Kemal Dervish was trying to undertake structural reforms in Turkey, he did not only have to come up with a robust policy measure to implement, but also confront a large scope of vested interests from various sectors in the country. So this is similar to İlhan Nebioğlu's comment about telecommunications. There was a time when he had to wear bulletproof vests due to the number of life threats he was receiving. So I'm wondering if the speakers think that the current situation in Turkey is now more or less prone to such vested interests, especially in construction and related sectors, and whether they see anyone challenging such interests anytime in the foreseeable future. So this is a good question, perhaps. I mean, we focused on the reforms, but perhaps the context, the socio-political context in which these reforms take place and the political context is also quite different. So maybe we can comment on that. There are two questions from Jens Bastian. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. If I'm not, please forgive me. They're asking Kemal to clarify a few points. So the first was about the effectiveness of sanctions. I think this was a little bit misunderstood because here the comment says, as more countries seek to join the BRICS, including speculation about Turkey joining, the efficiency of the sanctions regime declines by the sheer size and number of countries, which I think was kind of your point, that these sanctions are not necessarily effective. So, but maybe you might want to clarify that. There's also another question: how specifically did Mr. Dervish contribute to the debate about climate change? I'm surprised that Mr. Osan mentioned that. Can you please provide details? So two clarifications, I guess, specifically to Kemal. And then, this is an interesting question from Erhun Kulam from Bahçeşehir University. This is a very simple question. It sounds simple enough, but then the answer could be more complicated. Are there professors in Turkey who support Erdogan's view about the relationship between interest rates and inflation? So I guess this is related to the socio-economic context, the political context, and also a bit the cultural context as well. And I would consider asking the question, I mean, we talked about credibility in the sense that we discussed credibility of actors, of governments among international circles. But how about the credibility and trust in the government within the country? Is there any research or any findings in terms of like public's trust in the administration, in the government, impacting the economy And in this case, assuming perhaps that there is more trust in the way things are going at the moment, that we can see people within Turkey investing more and perhaps saving more as a result of that's helping with the economic situation. Okay, perhaps we can start in reverse order now, if that's all right. And perhaps we can start with Sinan, Kemal, and then and with Selva in this round. Yeah.
There were, a few important questions there, and I think I'll try to answer at least one. And that is whether today the political economy that we're witnessing in the country is similar to what was the case about 20 years ago. Yes and no. There are similarities, but there are also differences in the sense that today, yes, there are, vested interests. It's normal to have vested interests in every economic model. But the issue is whether the governance is set up so that the influence of those vested interests can be curtailed. And here, I think there are two areas where Turkey actually needs considerable progress. One is transparency, because one way to curtail the influence of vested interest is to bring transparency to government decisions and also allow what is generally called the fourth pillar in democratic societies, which is the media, to cover this. That's crucial if you are really interested in curtailing the influence of vested interests. And this is where considerable progress is needed in Turkey, in terms of allowing the media to cover these stories, to carry these stories, to act as the watchdog of these freedoms. Because when these freedoms are violated, that's the power of the media in democratic societies, their role as a watchdog. So that is one part of the answer that I want to give, that we need to underline in terms of the role that media can play in improving the overall political economy. The second one, of course, has to do with the rule of law, namely that if you want to again curtail, battle the influence of this vested interest, you need a non-partisan and independent mechanism where grievances can be settled. Where these challenges could be addressed. And the only known way in democratic societies to achieve that is to improve the norms around the rule of law. And this is also, at least when you look at where Turkey stands today, in a number of international indices regarding the rule of law. This is also where there really needs to be considerable progress. So I think in that sense, it may be relevant to ask whether Turkey was at a better place 20 years ago when we talk about this. Mm. And to some extent, my answer would be yes, because 20 years ago, the type of political environment that Turkey had, yes, did not produce perhaps very stable governments, and that's the downside. But the upside was that power was not concentrated. It was a fragmented power constellation, as a result of which the other elements that you have in a free democratic society had more room to act. and this includes the media and it includes the judiciary, because they were not under the influence of a hyper-centralized political system of power. And that's why I think the overall institutional underpinnings of Turkey 20 years ago, from that perspective, were different. There were other areas where, of course, Turkey has progressed over time, and things have vastly improved. But if we were to talk about, the role of the media as a watchdog in a democratic society and the rule of law, 20 years ago, Turkey was, we should at least be careful in comparing those two periods.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Kemal?
Yes, maybe I can start from the question that is related with Kemal's contribution on climate change. So as far as I remember, I remember reading reports from his time when he was serving as the head of the UNDP, and I think in 2007, as the head of the program, he initiated and oversaw a report that was devoted to climate change. So he was very much ahead of his time, I would say, because these topics became extremely important and became the frameworks of the Bretton Woods institutions of World Bank and the IMF. But Kemal was bringing these up way before, they were in the framework of these institutions. So you can also access to his writings, from the Brookings, his personal webpage at the Brookings. He was also contributing by just promoting ideas about how climate change is important, and climate is a public good, a global public good that doesn't require to provide incentives for others to join, because in the end, everyone is going to benefit from if the situation gets better. Related with the sanctions, let me be very clear about it. When I'm talking about sanctions, it is the Western countries imposing economic sanctions to Russia right now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is very much important, to understand what is the end goal of implementing these sanctions in order to assess its effectiveness. From my understanding, from my point of view, the objective of the sanctions is to end the war, and especially end the war in the which is close to the European territory, which has not been observed since the Second World War. And my generation in the current debate sometimes forget how devastating the war is, and preventing such event requires collective action. So here, the Western countries introduced economic sanctions to stop the war and to put President Putin under pressure. But third countries like India, Turkey, China did not join in sanctioning Russia. So I'm talking about these three blocks: sanctioning West, sanctioned Russia, and those who has not joined. From our research, my research with Fabio Giron and Daisun Kim, we find that in order for these sanctions to be effective, to hurt in terms of welfare in Russia, so that people will be upset about the current government and maybe put pressure to change the current behavior of the Russian government. So in order to make the welfare or the consumption drop further, there needs to be collective action in stopping some of the trade, including exports, imports, or exclusion from financial markets. And we have seen some of the examples that have been introduced in the last couple of months. So I think it is important to highlight this Cold War era view of Milton Friedman. Sanctions are ineffective because when you introduce a sanction, you create also inefficiency in your own country because you are imposing something artificial that is deviating from the market economy. And the sanctioning economy has always had the option to divert to the third countries, in this case, China, Turkey, India, so that sanctions are ineffective in that sense because of these substitution effects. So what we find in our research is that these substitution effects are not very much straightforward. Those who engage in trade also pay several costs to engage in trade. So you cannot substitute freely or in a frictionless environment. In order to conduct trade, like only those firms that are more productive than other firms that are only serving the market can engage in trade, for example. So they need to cover some of the costs like associated with increasing the quality of their products to be eligible for international trade. And in order to cover these costs, these come at an expense, and it is not very straightforward to answer the demand, additional demand coming from the substitution of Russia, like from the Western goods towards these third countries. But if you want to increase the effectiveness of sanctions on Russia in terms of drop in consumption, in terms of drop in welfare, consumption-based welfare, the cooperation between these third countries is essential. But when there is cooperation, there is also a negative impact on those countries who are cooperating with the West. And this opens the door for collaboration. So I would like to highlight like one thing, like Kemal's like last piece at the Project Syndicate was on Ukraine actually. But he was giving a very interesting example, like in between the two world wars, like World War I and World War II, there were like war reparation costs like imposed to Germany. And this sowed the seeds of Second World War, like by just hurting the German public, like at a very high level. And Keynes was complaining about the situation, and he wrote the economic consequences of peace, for example, in response to those war reparation agreement. So it is very also important, like not to hurt the Russian people like very much, because they can change their opinions on Western values. And especially after the war, like when we are going to talk about the reconstruction in Ukraine, so these will be crucial, like in making an agreement about engagement towards Western values. So this is how sanctions can act as a double-edged sword, and it should require a delicate balance, like when introducing those.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. Salva.
Okay, so let me start with Orkun's comment or question. He raised a very relevant topic, which is the difficulty in implementing structural reforms and the difficulties faced by Kemal Dervish, even life threats. While structural reforms are easy to say, we all have been saying that Turkey needs structural reforms, but they are hard to implement for exactly the same reasons that they were difficult in the past, because using an economic term, they are not Pareto optimal, meaning that you won't be able to improve the well-being of everyone. Somebody is going to lose and somebody is going to gain from these structural reforms. And the losers are going to protest. And you need to have a strong will and push back those pressures. Evidently, we had seen Kemal Dervish being strong enough. However, I'm not sure if the current government is willing to stand against those pressures, because there is this continuous habit of rent generation and distribution, which just became the way the policies are implemented. Like right now, the exporters are favored by the government, or the government limits gold imports and then gives permit to whomever is going to import gold. So the importers are going to benefit from the rent. In the past, it was the construction sector. So there are always some groups who are getting privileged benefits from the government. And the way to get around this is strong institutions and transparency, and a return to a market mechanism where you're going to be of equal distance to everyone. Unfortunately, we haven't quite seen this yet, even though it was the promise of Mehmet Şimşek. We still see deviations from the market mechanism. Like I said, there's still some rent distribution and a practice that doesn't, that has strong control of the state in the system. Regarding the other question, whether there are any professors in Turkey who support Erdogan's belief in the relationship between interest rate and inflation, let me first note that it is not some absurd idea that if you increase interest rates, cost of borrowing is going to increase. Therefore, the producers are going to reflect this onto their prices and inflation is going to go up. We already studied this. It's called the cost channel of monetary transmission mechanism. The problem is the cost channel is only valid for, let's say, 6 months after a rate hike. But if you wait long enough, then the demand channel is going to kick in. In other words, by keeping interest rates higher, you will be able to suppress demand, and that is going to lower inflationary pressures. Because the government has never been patient enough to pursue monetary policy from the day you start an action until the day you reap the benefits of the action, we've never seen the positive influence or the demand effect kicking in. And therefore, the government was not able to observe a strong disinflation program. Like when I had a chance to talk to Durmuş Yılmaz in one of our panels at Economic Research Forum, and he said, we were never patient enough to keep interest rates high enough. And as a result, we were never able to succeed in lowering inflation. So what Turkey needs to do is just show the determination to implement policy. So Erdogan's view, I guess the short answer to the long, to this tricky question is, yes, there is a cost channel, but that should not mean that the central bank should cut interest rates in order to lower inflation. It never works that way, because then the stronger demand is only going to get inflation off the track. I don't think there are any economists in Turkey who are going to believe this positive causal relationship, especially after our recent experience after September 2021. Turkey did cut interest rates and claimed that inflation would go down. We started with a 20% inflation. Then we have seen a peak of 85%. Inflation did not go down. It actually went off the rack. And right now it's around 60%. So I think our experience it was very educational in the sense that we all know that cutting interest rates to lower inflation does not work in practice.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. There are still some questions, but then I went through them and it feels like we have answered them one way or another through other discussions. So I would like to thank everyone in the audience for coming and for asking questions, for participating and for listening to us. If you enjoyed this event, please follow the LSE European Institute on Twitter, X, at LSEEI, and visit the Contemporary Turkish Studies website. Let me thank you very much. Thank you very much to Kemal Osan, Selva Demiralp, and Sinan Ülgen for being with us today and taking the time in their busy schedules. It was great listening to you and commemorating the work and achievements of Kemal Dervish. I hope we did justice to his legacy. Thank you and goodbye.